So even though this is Resurrection Sunday, Easter, when we celebrate the story of how Christ died and rose from the dead, and we're going to get to the resurrection story, don't worry, I thought it was still appropriate for us to continue our conversation about the book of Daniel and about these young Israelites in the time where we find ourselves in a place where we don't have control over our circumstances and we don't know how long things are going to continue in the way that they are. The story of Daniel gives us a lens to understand the trials that we find ourselves in and what our response to the resurrection looks like as faithful followers who are trying to seek after and follow Jesus. So we're going to continue in our study of Daniel. And just to give you a brief reflection on what we've done thus far, Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were young Israelites who were taken from the nation of Israel by the Babylonian Empire when Israel was defeated by Babylon. They are raised to become advisors for King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and the most powerful man in the known world at this time. They do well in his courts. They achieve, they are able to perform, they're able to do amazing things. But they remain faithful to the God of Israel, which is amazing because they've been taken from their families, taken from their nation, taken from the structures that help them to understand what it meant to be in relationship with God. And yet they remain faithful to God. They serve him and they follow him. And as we get to Daniel chapter 3, they've already had been tested in regards to whether or not they were going to follow God's expectations about food and the way they honored their bodies. They've been tested when their lives were in danger, and they had to trust the Lord to give them the answer and supply their salvation by providing them with the understanding of the king's dream. And Daniel was able to interpret the dream, tell them all about it. Daniel 3 finds us right after this has happened, when Daniel has been exalted by the king. He's been given a position of power, and the king has even praised both him and his God who he serves for doing amazing things. And that's what brings us to Daniel chapter 3. So if you want to grab your Bibles, I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to pause the video and read the first 7 verses, just verses 1 through 7, to set the stage for this story. Just choose somebody in with you to read it out loud, get a sense of what's happening as this story begins, and we'll continue from there. So go ahead, take a moment, read this section, and we'll go from there. So as this section begins, we see King Nebuchadnezzar, who's just had this interpretation of a dream where there was this fabulous statue, and Daniel says, "You, King Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of this statue made of gold." And the very next thing that happens is the king makes a statue of gold. Now, it doesn't tell us that it's a statue of him, but it's not a far reach to think that it probably was a statue in his likeness that he made, since Daniel just told him that he is the head of gold. So you can tell he kind of missed the point of what Daniel was trying to communicate with his whole vision. This dream that he had communicated that he, along with many other kingdoms that would follow him, would all have their moment of glory, but would pass and be destroyed. And only the kingdom of God, founded by him, would last forever. It's pretty incredible hubris, this pride, this sense of arrogance that he would build this statue and assume that everyone has to follow along with this. The other thing about this passage is that it's very descriptive. It goes through all of the instruments that are playing. It's kind of setting the stage, not just visually for the statue and all the people there, but even just what the sound of it was. The way that they're setting up this story, it's designed to be immersive. It's trying to bring us in, to make us inside the story ourselves, to start thinking about it as if we were there with them. That's a literary technique that they're using to help us engage with the story and start pondering our response related to it. So the stage is all set, the statue is set there, the king has set these laws, these commands that everyone has to bow down and worship as soon as the music kicks up, and anyone who doesn't do it is going to be killed in a very spectacular way by being thrown into a fiery furnace. And then verse 8, some of the Chaldeans, these are part of the wise men group, the people who Daniel and his friends are a part of that group. They come forward and they maliciously accuse the Jews of violating this command. This is coworker drama at its greatest. And for anybody who's working remotely and dealing with those kind of challenges, you know coworker drama. It's usually a little less murderous than this. But these guys, you can tell, they're trying to butter up the king. They're trying to get him on their side. They're setting the stage. They're like, oh, king, live forever. You can just hear it. They're the suck-ups. They're the ones who are trying to get in and really get in this deep jab on Daniel and his friends. And it's really this story. Daniel doesn't even show up in this story. This story is about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 12, they kind of draw attention. They're making their accusation. And they're like, there are these certain Jews you appointed over the affairs of the province. These men, they don't pay attention to you. They don't serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. And this throws him into a furious rage. And he gathers them together. He's upset that they're not obeying his commands. And he brings them together. And he asks them if it's true that they're not doing these things that he said. And he even gives them another chance. He says, when you hear the music, you need to get with the program. You need to do what I said. I'm the king. I'm the statue of gold. Come on, didn't you hear what Daniel said? You need to follow along. God gave me this command. And he gives them this last chance. And at the end of verse 15, he says, but who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Kind of challenging them. As they're challenging him, he's like, what you got? What's the solution that you have in this circumstance? And the way they respond, it's awesome. It's so wonderful. Verses 16 through 18. It says this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They say, our God can deliver us from the furnace, and he can deliver us from you. They have confidence in their reaction. But then they say, but if not, even if he doesn't, they say, he can deliver us from the furnace. He can deliver us from you. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to go along. The guts of these guys, the confidence that they have, the boldness and the peace with which they can answer in the face of fear and death, the anger of this king against them. It says his burning rage against them. The fact that they can respond with such confidence, their obedience to God is lived out in such incredible faith, even in the face of terrible adversity and fear. These three young men, brought from their home, raised in a foreign place to become advisors to a foreign king, still faithful to the God of their youth, still trusting that he is strong and able, that even if he doesn't save them, yet they will still serve him. There's a pretty big difference between believing that God can save you by revealing a dream or interpreting a dream and believing that he can save you from fire. Fire that you probably could see, fire that you probably understood was real. These young men had an understanding of the story of God's salvation, how he can move in incredible ways. God's power was not something that was foreign to them. They'd heard the story, maybe the story of Noah, of how God had saved a man and his family from the waters of judgment and how he had provided a way for them to be safe. Maybe they were familiar with the story of the Exodus, how God had saved their people by passing through the waters, by the blood of the Lamb on the Passover as they hid in their homes, how God was able to save them, how he provided for them in the wilderness miraculously. Maybe they knew the story of David and how God protected him and gave the giant Goliath and the Philistines over and over again into his hand, saving him against all odds. These young men, they knew the power of God and they believed it, not just as stories in their past, but as reality that they could lean on, even if it wasn't true for them. They knew that that God was still good enough to be faithful to. Daniel had changed the king's mind by hearing the dream. Their lives were saved. They had seen how this had played out, and they continued in faith. And they spoke boldly to the king. And his response was not very positive. In verse 19, he was filled with fury. The expression of his face was changed against these men. Again, they're drawing us into this story very visually, very auditorially. They want us to be right there with these guys. And they're thrown into the fire. In fact, he stokes the fire. He cranks it up to its highest setting. This fire is burning so hot that the soldiers who throw them in are killed. They're incinerated just from getting so close to it. This is really bad. This situation is about as bad as it could get. And in verse 23, as they are thrown in, bound, they're even tied up. They're thrown into this furnace, and the story could just end right there. They were faithful men, and now they're faithful martyrs. And it would be a sad story. We would admire them for their standing up for what was right, for being faithful in the face of adversity. But miraculously, this story doesn't end there. And it continues in verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. Having thrown them in, he was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And all the king's counselors and his leaders, they gathered together, and they saw the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any other god except their own." They are not alone in the furnace. This miraculous thing that Nebuchadnezzar sees as he threw 3 bound men into the fire to die, and he sees 4 men standing, walking around unharmed, and one who looks like the son of a god. God is with them in that furnace. He doesn't just save them, he stands with them. They're fully delivered from this fire. They don't even smell of it. The smell of smoke. And if you've ever been near a campfire, you know how that sits with you. That's my favorite smell in the whole world. That smell of campfire that gets on your sweatshirt and lingers. You can't even tell that they've been near to it. They have been completely removed from harm. They have been saved completely from this danger. These 3 men who are in unprecedented trouble, this has never happened in the story of God's people. They could believe in God's power to save in their circumstances. And they even acknowledged, even if he didn't save them, they would remain faithful and follow after him. But not only that, God was with them in the fire, that he walked with them into that dangerous place and delivered them from it. In our places of trial and fear, Does our confidence stem from a belief that not only can God save, but that he will be with us? How much more confidently can we put our trust in a God who saved his people from the waters of judgment in the time of Noah, from the slavery of Egypt from the time of Moses, from the hand of the Philistines in the time of David, and even from the fiery furnace and the fiery Nebuchadnezzar in the time of Daniel and his 3 friends? And he is alongside in all of those situations, which gives an even greater hope. And even more than that, in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God himself experiences that same sense of anguish, entering into trouble, and the relief of God's deliverance. And that's what we celebrate today at Easter. And we're going to talk about the story of the resurrection of Christ and what his followers experienced as they came to believe and understand that he was no longer dead, but that he was alive, as he said. But we're going to pause and we're going to sing again in worship as we reflect on the God who saved these young men, who walked into the fire with them and delivered them from it, but was with them in it. So let's continue in worship as we sing to the Lord of the hope that we have of the God who walks with us in these troubling situations.